When Margaret stepped off the train in 1885 expecting to meet her mail-order husband, she never imagined he'd take one look at her and declare her defective merchandise before sending her away that very day. But as she stood alone on the platform with nowhere to go, a gentle blacksmith appeared with an offer that would change everything and force her to discover whether a woman's worth is truly measured by society's cruel standards or by the authentic love that sees her heart. Could the woman deemed too fat for one man's narrow expectations find a love deeper than she ever dared dream possible? Margaret's hands shook as she stepped down from the train car, and it wasn't because of the cold wind blowing across the empty platform. She had traveled for 3 long days from Boston, sitting on hard wooden seats and eating stale bread, all to meet a man who had promised to marry her through letters. But now, as she looked around the small town of Clearwater Station, fear crept up her spine like a spider. The October air bit at her cheeks as she clutched her old leather bag. Inside were all her belongings: 2 dresses, her mother's silver brush, and the letters from Elias Hartwell. He had written such nice things about wanting a wife who could cook and keep house. He had said he didn't care about fancy looks, just someone who could work hard and be a good partner. Margaret touched the blue ribbon in her hair and smoothed down her best dress. She had scrubbed herself pink that morning in the train's tiny washroom, wanting to look perfect for her new husband. Her stomach felt like it was full of jumping frogs as she scanned the platform for a tall man with brown hair, just like Elias had described himself. "Miss Margaret O'Brien?" A deep voice called out behind her. She spun around, nearly dropping her bag. There stood a man who matched the description perfectly: tall, brown hair, wearing a nice coat and hat. But his face looked like he had just bitten into a sour apple. "Yes, that's me," Margaret said, trying to smile even though something felt wrong. "You must be Mr. Hartwell." Elias Hartwell looked her up and down like she was a horse he might buy at market. His eyes moved from her face to her body, and with each second, his frown grew deeper. Margaret felt her cheeks burn red with shame, though she didn't understand why. "This won't do at all," he said, shaking his head. "This simply won't do. I'm sorry." Margaret's voice came out small and confused. "What won't do?" "You're not what I ordered," Elias said, his words cutting through the air like a sharp knife. "I specifically asked the marriage agency for a delicate woman, someone refined and proper, someone who would look right standing next to me in church." Margaret felt like the ground might open up and swallow her whole. "But sir, I can cook and clean and sew. I can read and write, and I know my numbers. I can work from dawn to dusk without complaining." "That's not the point," Elias snapped, waving his hand like he was shooing away a fly. "Look at you. You're too substantial, too sturdy. I need a wife who looks like a lady, not a farm worker." The words hit Margaret like rocks thrown at her chest. She had always been bigger than other women, with strong arms from years of hard work and curves that her mother had said made her beautiful. But now this man, her supposed husband, was looking at her like she was broken goods. "I have your letters," Margaret said, pulling them from her bag with trembling fingers. "You said you wanted someone who could be a true partner, someone who wouldn't be afraid of hard work." Elias barely glanced at the papers. "I've changed my mind. The arrangement is cancelled. You'll need to find your own way back to wherever you came from." "But I spent all my money on the train ticket," Margaret whispered, her throat tight with tears she refused to let fall. "I sold everything I owned to come here." "That's not my problem," Elias said coldly. "I'm sending a telegram to the agency right now, asking for a replacement, someone more suitable this time." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone on the platform like a piece of forgotten luggage. The train that had brought her was already chugging away into the distance, black smoke disappearing into the gray sky. Margaret sank down onto a wooden bench, her bag clutched tight against her chest. Around her, the small town was waking up for the day. She could see people walking past the general store and the bank, all of them with places to go and people who wanted them there. But not her. She was stranded in a place where no one knew her name, with empty pockets and nowhere to sleep when night came. A fat tear rolled down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly. She wouldn't cry where people could see. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching her break apart like a dropped plate. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of horses and chimney smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, calling people to their daily prayers. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, telling her that she was precious and loved. But right now, those words felt like lies. How could she be precious when the first man to really look at her had thrown her away like spoiled milk? How could she be loved when she didn't even have a place to rest her head tonight? Margaret opened her eyes and looked down the main street of Clearwater Station. Somewhere in this town, there had to be someone who would help her. Someone who would see past her wide hips and strong shoulders to the woman underneath. But as the morning sun climbed higher and more people filled the streets, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her real troubles were just beginning. 2 hours later, Margaret's feet hurt from walking up and down the dusty main street, and her heart hurt even worse than her feet. She had knocked on the door of the boarding house, only to have a thin woman with sharp eyes look her up and down and declare that she had no rooms for women of questionable circumstances. "But I have references," Margaret had said, pulling out letters from her previous employers in Boston. "I'm a good worker, and I pay my debts. Can you pay tonight?" The woman had asked, crossing her arms over her narrow chest. "Well, no, but I could work to earn my keep until dash. No money, no room," the boarding housekeeper had said, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Now Margaret sat on the steps of the general store, watching people hurry past without meeting her eyes. News traveled fast in small towns, and it seemed like everyone already knew she was the mail-order bride who had been rejected before she even got off the train. A group of women stood near the bakery, their heads close together as they whispered and pointed in her direction. Margaret caught pieces of their words floating on the wind. Unsuitable. Deceived that poor man. What did she expect, looking like that? Each word felt like a bee sting, sharp and burning. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to make herself smaller on the store steps. Maybe if she sat very still, they would forget she was there and find someone else to talk about. But then she heard footsteps coming closer, and a shadow fell across her lap. Margaret looked up to see a woman about her own age, with kind eyes and a basket of bread tucked under her arm. "You look like you could use a friend," the woman said softly. "I'm Sarah Chen. My husband owns the restaurant down the street." Margaret blinked in surprise. This was the first person all day who had spoken to her like she was a real human being, not a piece of unwanted furniture. "I'm Margaret O'Brien," she said, standing up and brushing dust off her skirt. "Though I suppose everyone in town knows my story by now." Sarah smiled, and her whole face lit up like sunshine breaking through clouds. People love to talk in small towns, but most of them forget that every story has two sides. "Would you like to come have some tea? You look like you haven't eaten today." Margaret's stomach chose that moment to rumble loudly, reminding her that she had been too nervous to eat breakfast on the train. "I couldn't impose," she said, even though the offer sounded like the most wonderful thing in the world. "It's not an imposition if I'm offering," Sarah said firmly. "Besides, I could use the company. Running a restaurant means I'm always cooking for other people but rarely have anyone to talk to while I eat." As they walked toward the restaurant, Margaret felt some of the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. Maybe not everyone in Clearwater Station was going to treat her like a circus freak. The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the warm smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. Sarah led Margaret to a table by the window and bustled off to bring tea and sandwiches. "So tell me," Sarah said when she returned, pouring hot tea into delicate cups. "What's your story? And I mean your real story, not the version the gossips are spreading around town." Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup and felt tears threaten again. It had been so long since someone had asked what she thought, what she felt, what had really happened. "I came here to marry Elias Hartwell," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had been writing letters for months. He seemed kind in his writing, and he said he wanted a wife who could be a true partner, not just a decoration. Sarah nodded, encouraging her to continue. But when he saw me, Margaret's voice broke a little. He said I wasn't what he ordered, like I was a dress that came in the wrong size. What a terrible thing to say, Sarah said, her dark eyes flashing with anger. You seem perfectly lovely to me. But maybe he was right, Margaret said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Maybe I was foolish to think a man could want someone like me. I'm not small and delicate like other women. I'm strong and sturdy, better suited for farm work than drawing rooms. Sarah set down her teacup with a sharp clink. Margaret O'Brien, you listen to me. There is nothing wrong with being strong. There is nothing shameful about taking up space in this world. Any man who can't see your worth because he's too busy measuring your waist is not worthy of you. The words hit Margaret like a splash of cold water, shocking and clear. No one had ever told her that her strength was a good thing before. Back in Boston, people had always made her feel like she needed to apologize for being bigger than other women, for having muscles in her arms and width in her hips. But now I'm stuck here with no money and nowhere to go, Margaret said, practical worries crowding out the warm feeling Sarah's words had given her. I spent everything I had to come here. Sarah was quiet for a moment, tapping her finger against her teacup while she thought. You know, she said finally, there might be someone who could help you. Have you met Samuel McKinnon yet? Margaret shook her head. He's the blacksmith. Lost his wife about 3 years ago, and he's been struggling to keep up with both his forge work and his household ever since. He's a good man, honest and kind. Maybe he could use some help, and maybe you could use some honest work while you figure out what comes next. Hope flickered in Margaret's chest like a tiny candle flame. Do you think he would really consider hiring me? Even after what happened today? Samuel doesn't listen much to gossip, Sarah said with a smile. He judges people by their actions, not their circumstances. And right now, you look like someone who's willing to work hard for a fair chance. As Margaret finished her sandwich and prepared to meet this mysterious blacksmith, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something new, or just another disappointment waiting to happen. A hammer rang against hot metal like a church bell calling lost souls home. Margaret followed the sound through the empty streets, drawn by something she couldn't name. Sparks flew from the blacksmith shop like tiny falling stars, and warmth poured from the open doorway into the cold October night. Ma'am, you look like someone who needs help. The voice made Margaret jump. A man stepped from the shadows beside his forge, and her heart hammered harder than his tools. After Hartwell's cruel words, she expected every man to look at her with the same disgust. But this stranger's eyes held something different, something gentle. I don't want to bother anyone, Margaret said, pulling her shawl tight. Her stomach growled loud enough for him to hear, and her cheeks burned with shame. The blacksmith smiled. I'm Samuel McKinnon, and you're not bothering anyone. My late wife always said an empty table was a sad thing. He wiped his hands on his leather apron. She'd come back to haunt me if I let a lady go hungry. Margaret studied his face in the firelight. Samuel looked about 40, with kind eyes and strong hands marked by honest work. His shop was neat and clean, tools hung in perfect order. Everything about him seemed steady and safe. I couldn't take your food, she whispered. You're not taking anything. I'm offering. Samuel moved to close his forge for the night. Besides, I made too much stew again. Been doing that for 3 years now, ever since my Mary passed. Can't seem to remember I'm cooking for one. The mention of his dead wife made Margaret's chest tighten. This man knew loss. Maybe he understood what it felt like to be unwanted. My name is Margaret, she said quietly. Well then, Margaret, would you do me the honor of helping me eat this stew before it goes bad? She followed him to a small cabin behind the shop. The inside was simple but clean, with a table set for two as if he'd been expecting company. A pot of stew bubbled on the wood stove, filling the room with the smell of beef and vegetables. Samuel ladled thick stew into 2 bowls and set out fresh bread. Mary always said food tastes better when shared, he explained, pulling out a chair for Margaret. The first spoonful nearly made her cry. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, or how long it had been since someone showed her simple kindness. Samuel ate quietly, not asking questions or staring at her like she was some strange creature. "This is wonderful," Margaret said after several spoonfuls. "Mary's recipe. She was the cook in the family. I just follow her notes." Samuel pointed to a piece of paper stuck to the wall, covered in faded handwriting. "She wrote down everything before she got too sick to teach me." Margaret could hear the love in his voice when he spoke of his wife. It made something ache inside her chest. Hartwell had never spoken of anyone with such tenderness. "How long were you married?" she asked. 15 years. We came out here together when we were barely 20. Built this place with our own hands." Samuel's eyes grew distant. "She wanted children, but it never happened. Said God had other plans for us." The sadness in his voice was quiet and deep, like still water. Margaret recognized it because she carried her own version of that same sadness. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. "Thank you. And I'm sorry for whatever brought you to my doorstep looking like the world had ended." Margaret set down her spoon. Should she tell him the truth? That she'd come here as a mail-order bride only to be rejected? That she had nowhere to go and no money for a ticket home? "I came here to marry someone," she said slowly. "It didn't work out." Samuel nodded without judgment. "His loss, I'd say." Those simple words hit Margaret like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had taken her side without even knowing the whole story? "You don't know what happened," she said. "Don't need to. Any man who'd let a woman like you walk away is a fool." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "You don't even know me. I know you have good manners. I know you're grateful for kindness. I know you're brave enough to travel far from home for a chance at something better." Samuel counted these things off on his fingers. Those are the things that matter. After dinner, Samuel showed her to a small room that had once been his wife's sewing space. "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." "I can't pay you," Margaret said. "Did I ask for payment?" She shook her head, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Then don't worry about it. Mary always said the Lord provides for those who need it most." That night, Margaret lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt safe. But could she trust this feeling? Could she trust Samuel's kindness? Men had disappointed her before. Her father had died when she was young, leaving her family poor. The man she'd almost married in Boston had chosen someone with a bigger dowry. And now Hartwell had rejected her too. But Samuel seemed different. The way he spoke of his wife, the gentle way he'd offered help without expecting anything in return. Maybe not all men were like the others. Margaret touched the amber locket at her throat and whispered a prayer. Maybe, just maybe, God wasn't finished with her story yet. Whispers followed Margaret down Main Street like hungry dogs. She kept her eyes straight ahead, but the words hit her anyway. That's her. The one Hartwell sent back. Shameless. Staying with a widower like that. Poor Samuel doesn't know what kind of woman she really is. Margaret's hands shook as she pushed open the door to Miller's General Store. She needed thread to mend Samuel's work shirts, and this was the only store in town. The bell above the door announced her entrance, and every conversation stopped. Mrs. Cordelia Whitman stood near the fabric counter, surrounded by 3 other ladies. Their stares felt like pins sticking into Margaret's skin. Well, Mrs. Whitman said loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it isn't our mysterious visitor." Margaret walked to the thread display, trying to ignore the women's whispers. But their voices grew louder, meant for her ears. "I heard she's been living with Samuel McKinnon for a whole week now," said Mrs. Ferguson, the banker's wife. "Living in sin, more likely," added Mrs. Whitman. "Taking advantage of that poor man's good nature." "Someone should warn him," said a third woman. "Men don't always see these things clearly." Margaret's face burned with shame and anger. She found the thread she needed and walked to the counter where Mr. Miller waited. His face was carefully blank, but she could see the questions in his eyes. "Just the thread today, miss?" He paused, realizing he didn't know her last name. "Walker," Margaret supplied. "Margaret Walker. That'll be 10 cents. Margaret counted out the coins with trembling fingers. Behind her, the women's whispers grew more cruel. "I heard she was supposed to marry Hartwell, but he took one look and changed his mind. Can't blame him. A man wants a wife, not a workhorse. She's probably desperate enough to try anything now." Margaret's vision blurred with tears of rage. She wanted to turn around and tell these women exactly what she thought of their gossip. But what was the point? They'd already decided who she was. The store bell chimed again, and Samuel walked in. His work clothes were dusty from the forge, and his hair was messed from the wind. But when he saw Margaret's face, his expression hardened. "Good morning, ladies," he said politely to the group of women. Then he moved to stand beside Margaret. "Find everything you needed?" His presence at her side felt like armor against the staring eyes and whispered judgments. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "Mrs. Whitman," Samuel said, turning to the leader of the gossiping group. "I believe you ordered new hinges for your chicken coop? They came in yesterday." Mrs. Whitman's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Yes, I did. I'll have them ready this afternoon. Same price we discussed." It was a polite conversation, but Margaret heard the warning underneath Samuel's words. He was reminding Mrs. Whitman that she needed his services, just like everyone else in town. As they left the store together, Margaret heard Mrs. Whitman's voice rise again. "Mark my words, that woman will bring nothing but trouble to this town." Outside, Margaret stopped walking and turned to Samuel. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should leave before I ruin your reputation." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Let me tell you something about reputation, Margaret. I've lived in this town for 20 years. I've shod their horses, fixed their tools, and never cheated anyone out of a penny. If they think one woman can destroy all that, then their opinion isn't worth much. But the talk will hurt your business. Let it. I've got enough saved to weather a little gossip." Samuel's voice gentled. "Besides, Mary used to say that people who spend their time tearing others down usually have pretty small lives of their own." They walked home in silence, but Margaret's mind raced. The women's words had cut deep, partly because they echoed her own fears. Was she taking advantage of Samuel's kindness? Was she asking for more than she deserved? That evening, as she prepared dinner in Samuel's kitchen, these doubts grew stronger. She'd been here a week now, cooking his meals and mending his clothes. What did that make her? His housekeeper? His charity case? "You're quiet tonight," Samuel observed as they sat down to eat. "Just thinking. About what those women said?" Margaret nodded, stirring her soup without really seeing it. "Margaret, look at me." Samuel waited until she met his eyes. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" She shook her head, afraid of his answer. "I see a woman who traveled 1,000 miles for a chance at something better. I see someone who says thank you for every small kindness. I see gentle hands that can mend anything broken." Samuel's voice grew softer. "I see someone who makes this house feel like a home again. But what if they're right? What if I'm just? What if you're just what? A good person who deserves better than she got?" Samuel reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "Margaret, I've been alone for 3 years. I know the difference between charity and something more." The something more hung in the air between them, unnamed but real. Margaret felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. But outside, the wind carried the sound of voices from the street. The townspeople were talking, judging, waiting to see what would happen next. And Margaret knew their real test was just beginning. The hammer struck red-hot iron with such force that sparks flew like angry fireflies through the morning air. Margaret jumped back from the forge, her heart racing as Samuel's powerful arms brought the heavy tool down again and again. She had never seen a man work metal before, and the raw strength needed to bend iron to his will both frightened and amazed her. "Sorry about the noise," Samuel called over the ringing blows. "Mrs. Peterson's horse threw a shoe yesterday, and she needs her wagon ready for the grain delivery." Margaret watched as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air. The fire from the forge painted his face in shades of gold and orange. This was so different from the quiet, gentle man who had shared evening meals with her. Here, he was a force of nature, commanding fire and metal with hands that had also tenderly bandaged her scraped knuckles just 2 days before. "Can I help somehow?" she asked, stepping closer but staying clear of the flying sparks. Samuel paused, the hammer suspended in mid-air. "You want to help with blacksmith work?" "I've never tried, but I learn quickly." Margaret lifted her chin, remembering how many times people had told her she couldn't do something simply because she was a woman. A slow smile spread across Samuel's face. "Well then, let's see what you're made of." He showed her how to work the bellows, pumping air into the fire to keep it burning hot enough to soften the iron. The leather handles were smooth from years of use, and Margaret found a rhythm in the steady back-and-forth motion. Her arms began to ache after just a few minutes, but she kept going, determined to prove herself useful. "That's perfect," Samuel said, his voice warm with approval. "You've got strong hands." The words made Margaret's chest swell with pride. Strong hands. Not delicate or refined, but strong. Here was a man who saw her sturdy build as an advantage rather than a flaw. As the morning wore on, Margaret learned to hold the iron steady while Samuel shaped it. She watched in wonder as a simple piece of metal became a perfect horseshoe under his skilled hands. The work was hot, dirty, and completely unlike anything she had ever imagined doing, but she loved every minute of it. "You're a natural," Samuel said as they took a break to drink cool water from the well. "Most people can't handle the heat and noise on their first try." Margaret looked down at her soot-stained apron and laughed. "I probably look like a chimney sweep." "You look like a woman who isn't afraid of honest work," Samuel replied seriously. "That's a rare and beautiful thing." The word beautiful hung in the air between them like a soap bubble, fragile and shimmering. Margaret had been called many things in her 26 years, but rarely beautiful. Practical, yes. Capable, certainly. But beautiful? Their quiet moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mrs. Peterson appeared around the corner of the forge, her gray hair pinned severely beneath a black bonnet. She stopped short when she saw Margaret, taking in the soot-stained dress and the water ladle in her hand. "I see you found yourself some help," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice as cold as November wind. "Margaret has been learning the trade," Samuel said easily, but Margaret noticed the tension that crept into his shoulders. "How unusual." Mrs. Peterson's pale eyes swept over Margaret from head to toe. "I suppose some women will do anything to secure a man's attention." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Heat flooded her cheeks, but this time it wasn't from the forge fire. It was the burning shame of being misunderstood yet again. "Mrs. Peterson," Samuel's voice carried a warning note. "Margaret is a guest in my home, and she'll be treated with respect." "Of course," the older woman replied, though her tone suggested anything but respect. "I'm sure the whole town finds your arrangement quite interesting." After Mrs. Peterson left with her newly shod horse, Margaret and Samuel worked in uncomfortable silence. The joy had gone out of the morning, replaced by the heavy weight of judgment. Margaret fumbled with the bellows, her hands shaking with anger and embarrassment. "Don't let her get to you," Samuel said gently. "Cordelia Peterson has had a sour disposition since before I was born." "It's not just her," Margaret burst out. "It's everyone in this town. They look at me and see a woman of loose morals, a burden, a charity case. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should have stayed on that train and gone back to Boston." Samuel set down his hammer with deliberate care. Is that what you really think? Margaret stared at the glowing coals in the forge, fighting back tears. I don't know what to think anymore. In Boston, I was nobody special, but at least I had a place. Here, I'm neither wife nor servant nor respectable boarder. I'm just nothing. You're not nothing to me. The words were spoken so quietly that Margaret almost missed them over the crackling of the fire. When she looked up, Samuel was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What am I to you then? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. You're the woman who makes my morning coffee taste better just because you're sitting across the table. You're the person who noticed that my late wife's roses needed pruning and spent an entire afternoon caring for them without being asked. You're someone who sees a lonely man and offers friendship without expecting anything in return. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. And you're someone I'm starting to care about more than I probably should. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. More than you should? You came here to marry another man, Samuel pointed out. You have every right to leave whenever you choose. I have no claim on you, no right to ask you to stay. But Margaret. He stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. I hope you will. The afternoon sun slanted through the open doors of the forge, painting golden rectangles on the dirt floor. In that warm light, with the smell of coal smoke and metal filings in the air, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. It was like the moment when Samuel's hammer struck the iron just right, and rigid metal became something new and useful. I don't want to leave, she admitted, but I'm scared. Of what? Of believing this is real. Of thinking I could actually belong somewhere. Margaret twisted her hands in her apron. What if you change your mind about me? What if you decide I'm too much trouble, like Mr. Hartwell did? Samuel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't move, he cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. Margaret, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing her own reflection in their gray depths. I'm not Hartwell, Samuel said firmly. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I don't change my mind about people based on gossip or appearances. If I say you belong here, I mean it. Margaret felt something warm and bright unfurl in her chest. For the first time since stepping off that train, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found not just shelter, but home. But even as Samuel's thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile happiness was balanced on a knife's edge. The looks from townspeople were growing colder each day, and she knew that sooner or later, something would have to give. The question was, when that moment came, would their connection be strong enough to survive the storm? The telegram arrived like a rattlesnake striking without warning, its yellow paper crackling in Margaret's trembling fingers as she read the words that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Young Timothy Fletcher had ridden his horse hard from the train station, his face flushed with excitement at delivering what he clearly thought was good news. He stood in Samuel's kitchen doorway, hat in hand, grinning like he'd just announced Christmas was coming early. Mr. Hartwell paid extra to make sure this got to you quick, Miss Margaret, Timothy panted. Said it was urgent business that couldn't wait. Margaret stared at the telegram, reading it 3 times before the meaning fully sank in. Hartwell's wife deceased in childbirth. Seeking original arrangement. Train arrives Friday afternoon. Prepare yourself for departure. All forgiven. The words swam before her eyes like black ants on yellow paper. Elias Hartwell's young bride, the delicate flower he had chosen over Margaret, was dead. And now he wanted her back, as if she were a coat hanging in his closet, waiting to be claimed when the weather turned cold. Bad news? Timothy asked, his excitement fading as he noticed Margaret's pale face. No, Margaret managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Thank you for bringing it. After Timothy left, Margaret sank into the wooden chair by the kitchen table, the telegram still clutched in her shaking hands. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin. Through the window, she could see Samuel working at his forge, unaware that their peaceful world was about to be shattered. She thought about the girl, Hannah, her name had been. Barely 18, with corn silk hair and a waist so tiny Margaret could have spanned it with her 2 hands. She had seen Hannah once in town, clinging to Hartwell's arm like a child afraid of getting lost. Now that child was dead, along with whatever baby she had tried to bring into the world. Margaret felt sick with a mixture of pity and terror. Poor Hannah, dying so young, so far from home. And poor Margaret, whose safe haven was about to disappear like morning mist. The kitchen door opened with a creak of hinges, and Samuel stepped inside, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. He took one look at Margaret's face and crossed the room in 3 quick strides. "What's wrong?" he demanded, his voice sharp with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret wordlessly handed him the telegram. She watched his face change as he read, saw his jaw tighten and his gray eyes turn stormy as winter clouds. "Over my dead body," Samuel growled, crumpling the yellow paper in his fist. "You're not going anywhere with that man." "But what if I should?" The words tumbled out before Margaret could stop them. "What if this is God's way of telling me I was wrong to think I could have something better?" Samuel stared at her as if she'd sprouted horns. "Better? Margaret, the man called you defective merchandise. He threw you away like a broken tool. What could possibly be better about going back to someone who treated you that way?" Margaret stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Her mind was spinning like a child's top, thoughts colliding and bouncing off each other. "He's offering me marriage, Samuel. A real marriage with a home of my own and a respectable position in society. What do I have here? I'm living in another woman's house, sleeping in another woman's bed, using another woman's dishes. This could be your house," Samuel said quietly, "if you wanted it to be." The words hung in the air like smoke from the forge fire. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat, but the fear was stronger than the hope. Could it? Really? Or am I just a convenient replacement for your wife? The same way I'd be a convenient replacement for Hartwell's. Samuel's face went white, as if she had slapped him. "Is that really what you think? That I see you as a replacement for Emily?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. "I don't know what to think. I've been here less than 2 weeks, Samuel. How can you possibly know what you want? How can Hartwell know what he wants?" Samuel shot back. He picked his wife based on her photograph and threw her away when she didn't meet his expectations. "At least I've spent time with you. I've seen you laugh and cry and work and worry. I know you're stubborn and proud and scared of being hurt. I know you sing under your breath when you think no one is listening, and you always check the locks twice before bed because your mother taught you to be careful." Margaret blinked in surprise. She hadn't realized he had noticed so many small details about her habits. "That's not love, Samuel," she said softly. "That's just paying attention." "Maybe love starts with paying attention," Samuel replied. "Maybe it grows from seeing someone clearly and still wanting them to stay." Margaret turned back to the window, watching clouds gather on the horizon. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the heavy air and see it in the way the horses in the distant pasture clustered together for comfort. "Hartwell can give me security," she said, though the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "A big house, fine clothes, servants to help with the work. You're asking me to choose a blacksmith's small life over all of that." "I'm not asking you to choose anything," Samuel said, and Margaret was surprised by the sadness in his voice. "I'm just asking you to be honest about what you really want." Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. What did she want? For 26 years, she had wanted to be chosen, to be valued, to have a secure place in the world. Hartwell's telegram offered all of those things. So why did the thought of boarding Friday's train make her feel like she was drowning? "I'm scared, Samuel," she whispered. "I'm scared of making the wrong choice. I'm scared of staying and having you realize you made a mistake." I'm scared of leaving and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Samuel's reflection appeared in the window behind hers, his face grave and gentle. Fear is a poor reason to make any choice, Margaret. You can't live your whole life trying to avoid getting hurt. Can't I? Margaret turned to face him, tears blurring her vision. You don't understand what it's like to be a woman with no family, no money, no beauty to recommend her. One wrong choice and I could end up with nothing. At least with Hartwell, I know what I'm getting. Do you? Samuel asked quietly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you'd be getting a man who sees you as property, not a person. A man who'll discard you again the moment someone prettier catches his eye. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And what would I be getting with you? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes serious. A man who thinks you're perfect exactly as you are. A man who wants to build a life with you, not just use you to fill an empty space. A man who... He paused, taking a deep breath. A man who loves you, Margaret, not as a replacement for anyone else, but as yourself. The words hit Margaret like lightning, bright and shocking and terrifying. Love. He had said the word she had been afraid to even think about. How can you love me? She whispered. You barely know me. I know enough, Samuel said simply. I know you're brave enough to travel across the country to marry a stranger. I know you're kind enough to tend a dead woman's roses. I know you're strong enough to work a forge and gentle enough to cry over a stranger's death. What more do I need to know? Margaret felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, with safety behind her and the unknown stretching out below. Friday's train would carry her back to the familiar world of expectations and limitations. But staying would mean taking a leap of faith that terrified her more than anything she had ever contemplated. I need time to think, she said finally. Samuel nodded, though she could see the worry in his eyes. Of course you do. But Margaret, whatever you decide, decide for yourself. Not because you're afraid, not because of what other people expect, but because it's what you truly want. As thunder rumbled in the distance and the first drops of rain began to patter against the window, Margaret wondered if she even knew what she truly wanted anymore. The safe choice lay behind her, but her heart was pulling her towards something that felt as dangerous and uncertain as the approaching storm. The question was, did she have the courage to choose love over security, even if it meant risking everything she had ever believed about herself? The church bell was still ringing when Elias Hartwell stepped off the Friday morning train, and every person on Main Street stopped what they were doing to stare. Margaret felt her heart drop like a stone into deep water as she watched him straighten his black coat and adjust his gold pocket watch chain. He looked exactly the same as the day he had rejected her, tall, proud, and completely sure of himself. Well, I'll be, whispered Mrs. Ferguson from behind the mercantile counter. That's Elias Hartwell himself. Come back to Clearwater. Margaret pressed her back against the wooden post outside Samuel's blacksmith shop, hoping somehow to become invisible. But Hartwell's sharp eyes found her immediately, and a slow smile spread across his face like oil on water. He tipped his hat to the gathering crowd and began walking straight toward her. Margaret, my dear, he called out loud enough for half the town to hear. How wonderful to see you looking so well. Samuel appeared beside her so quickly she jumped. His leather apron was still tied around his waist, and his hands were black with soot from the morning's work. The muscle in his jaw twitched as he watched Hartwell approach. Hartwell, Samuel said, his voice flat as a hammer striking cold metal. McKinnon. Hartwell nodded once, then turned his full attention back to Margaret. I suppose you received my wire about my change in circumstances? The whole street had gone quiet. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension in the air. Margaret could feel dozens of eyes watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Her mouth felt dry as sand. I got your message, she managed to say. Hartwell stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. Then you understand why I've come. My poor Clara, God rest her soul, was simply too delicate for frontier life. The doctor said her constitution wasn't strong enough for childbearing. He paused, letting his words sink in. I realize now that I need a wife with more substantial qualities. Behind them, Margaret heard Mrs. Whitman gasp. Several other women began whispering furiously among themselves. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but whether from shame or anger, she couldn't tell. You have some nerve, Samuel said, taking a step forward. Hartwell raised one eyebrow. I beg your pardon? You heard me. Samuel's voice was getting louder. You treated Margaret like damaged goods, sent her away without a penny, and now you waltz back into town expecting her to be grateful? Now see here, McKinnon. Hartwell's voice turned cold. My business is with Margaret, not with you. Unless. He looked back and forth between them, and his expression changed. Oh, I see. How interesting. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. The way he was looking at her made her feel dirty, like she had done something wrong just by accepting Samuel's kindness. There's nothing improper happening here, she said quickly. Of course not, Hartwell agreed, but his tone suggested he thought otherwise. Though I must say, Margaret, you've put me in a rather awkward position. When I wrote to the matrimonial agency explaining that my first bride had proven unsuitable, they assured me you would still be available. The crowd was growing larger. Margaret could see faces peering out from shop windows and doorways. Young Timothy Fletcher had even climbed up on a wooden crate to get a better view. She felt trapped, like a butterfly pinned to a board for everyone to examine. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Nonsense. Hartwell waved his hand dismissively. These good people have a right to know what's happening in their community. After all, they've been sheltering you for. He pretended to think. How long has it been? 3 months? 4? That's enough, Samuel warned. But Hartwell wasn't finished. I'm prepared to honor our original agreement, Margaret. In fact, I'm willing to overlook your current situation and proceed with the wedding as planned. Surely you can appreciate my generosity. Margaret felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest. Your generosity? Indeed. Not every man would be so forgiving. Hartwell straightened his vest. I've even brought a new dress for the ceremony. Something more appropriate than. He gestured vaguely at her simple blue cotton dress. From somewhere in the crowd, she heard a woman mutter, Well, I never. Samuel's hands had curled into fists. Margaret doesn't need your forgiveness for anything. Doesn't she? Hartwell's smile was cold as winter wind. Living unchaperoned with a man she's not married to? In my day, we had a word for women who. Finish that sentence and I'll knock you into next week. Samuel interrupted, his voice dangerous. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret could see that several of the men in the crowd were taking sides, some moving closer to Samuel, others nodding approval at Hartwell's words. This was about to turn into something much worse than just harsh words. Stop, she said, but her voice was too quiet. Hartwell straightened his shoulders. I don't think you understand your position here, McKinnon. I'm offering to make an honest woman of Margaret. What exactly are you offering her? A life of poverty in this forgotten corner of nowhere? The constant whispers and judgment of these people. I'm offering her respect, Samuel shot back. Something you never gave her. Respect. Hartwell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Is that what you call it? Tell me, Margaret, has McKinnon proposed marriage? Has he offered you his name and protection? Or are you simply playing house while he enjoys the benefits without the commitment? Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. In all their time together, Samuel had never spoken of marriage. They had grown close, yes, but he had never said anything about love or a future together. What if Hartwell was right? What if Samuel was just being kind to a woman with nowhere else to go? That's not, she started to say, then stopped, because suddenly she wasn't sure. Samuel turned to look at her, and she saw something like panic in his eyes. Margaret, don't listen to him. You know that's not how it is between us. Do I? The words came out before she could stop them. You've never said. We've never talked about. Ah, Hartwell said softly, like a cat who had found a mouse. I see the problem now. You've been living in a fantasy, my dear. Poor McKinnon probably felt sorry for you and let you stay out of pity. But pity isn't the same as love, is it? The crowd was pressing closer now, hanging on every word. Margaret felt like she was drowning in their stares, their whispers, their judgment. Everything she had built over the past months was crumbling around her like a house made of sand. Margaret, Samuel said desperately, please don't let him poison your mind with lies. But the doubt was already there, growing like a weed in her heart. What if it was all pity? What if she had been fooling herself this whole time? Hartwell sensed his advantage and pressed forward. I'm offering you security, Margaret. A real marriage with a man of standing in the community. Not empty promises from someone who's had months to propose and hasn't. Margaret looked around at all the watching faces, felt the weight of their expectations and judgments pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. I need time, she whispered. Hartwell smiled triumphantly. Of course, my dear, but don't take too long. The evening train leaves at 6 o'clock, and I have business to attend to back east. This is your chance to make something of yourself. As he walked away, tipping his hat to the ladies and shaking hands with the men, Margaret stood frozen in place. The crowd began to break up, people returning to their shops and homes with plenty to talk about over dinner. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Margaret could already feel it taking root. What if everything she thought she knew about Samuel's feelings was just wishful thinking? Margaret sat alone in Samuel's kitchen as the afternoon shadows grew longer, staring at the cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Every time she heard footsteps on the wooden walkway outside, her heart jumped, thinking it might be Samuel coming back from his deliveries. But he had been avoiding the house since the confrontation, and she couldn't blame him. The silence was broken by a soft knock at the door. Margaret's pulse quickened, but when she opened it, she found young Timothy Fletcher standing on the porch, twisting his cap in his hands. Begging your pardon, Miss Margaret, he said, his voice cracking. But my ma sent me to fetch you. Says there's something you need to see. Margaret followed Timothy through the dusty streets to the boarding house, where a small crowd had gathered around Mrs. Fletcher. The older woman held a piece of paper in her trembling hands, and her face was pale as milk. What is it? Margaret asked. Mrs. Fletcher looked up with tears in her eyes. It's a letter from my sister in Denver. She says, her voice broke. She says Elias Hartwell's wife didn't die in childbirth like he claimed. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. What? Clara Hartwell is alive and well, according to this letter. She ran away from him 3 weeks ago and took shelter at my sister's boarding house. Says he was. Mrs. Fletcher's voice dropped to a whisper. Says he was cruel to her. Used his fists when she displeased him. Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. That can't be true. It is true, said a new voice. They all turned to see Dr. Morrison approaching, his medical bag in his hand and his face grim. I just received a telegram from a colleague in Denver. Clara Hartwell is seeking a divorce on grounds of cruelty. She's asking if any other women have been harmed by her husband. The pieces began falling into place in Margaret's mind like dominoes. Hartwell's quick dismissal of her when she arrived. His immediate order for a replacement bride. His cold manner and the way he talked about women like they were objects to be bought and returned. He lied, she whispered. About everything, Dr. Morrison confirmed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, like the moment right before a thunderstorm breaks. For months, she had been wondering if she was good enough, pretty enough, worthy enough. But the real question wasn't about her worth at all. It was about recognizing the difference between a man who saw her as a person and one who saw her as property. She thought about Samuel's gentle hands as he taught her to use his tools. The way he listened when she read to him in the evenings. How he had never once made her feel like she owed him anything for his kindness. How he had defended her against the town gossips without being asked. And then she thought about Hartwell's cold calculation. His willingness to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. The way he had tried to make her doubt herself, and the one good thing that had happened to her since leaving Boston. "Timothy," she said suddenly, "do you know where Samuel is working today?" "Yes, ma'am. He's shoeing horses at the Miller farm, about 2 miles out on the North Road." Margaret lifted her skirts and started walking. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Fletcher calling her name, but she didn't stop. She had spent too many months letting other people make decisions about her life. It was time to take control of her own story. The walk to the Miller farm took her past the train station, where she could see Hartwell pacing back and forth on the platform, checking his pocket watch. The evening train wasn't due for another 2 hours, but he was clearly expecting her to appear at any moment with her bags packed. She almost laughed at how wrong he was. Samuel was bent over a horse's hoof when she arrived, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool air. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and she saw hope and fear war across his features. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" "I came to tell you something important." She took a deep breath. "Elias Hartwell is a liar. His wife isn't dead. She ran away from him because he was hurting her." Samuel dropped the horse's hoof and straightened slowly. "What?" Margaret told him everything, the letter from Denver, Dr. Morrison's telegram, the growing evidence that Hartwell was not the respectable man he pretended to be. As she spoke, she watched Samuel's expression change from confusion to understanding to anger. "That snake," he said quietly. "He was trying to manipulate you into going with him." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "But that's not the most important thing I came to tell you." Samuel waited, his eyes fixed on her face. "The most important thing is that I finally understand what my mother meant when she said a woman's worth isn't measured by how small she can make herself, but by how much love she can hold." Margaret stepped closer to him. "For months, I've been wondering if I was worthy of love. But that was the wrong question." "What's the right question?" Samuel asked softly. "The right question is whether the person offering love is worthy of me." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "You are, Samuel. You've shown me every day that I have value just as I am. You've never tried to change me or make me smaller or quieter or more convenient." Samuel reached out tentatively, as if afraid she might disappear. "Margaret, I should have told you before how I feel about you. I should have made it clear that this isn't charity or pity." "Then tell me now," she said. He took her hands in his, and she could feel the strength in them, the gentleness that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. "I love you, Margaret, not because you're practical or capable or because you keep house well. I love you because when you laugh it sounds like music, because you read Shakespeare aloud with such passion that you make me believe in magic. Because you're brave enough to start over in a place where you knew no one." Margaret felt something inside her chest unfold like a flower opening to sunlight. "I love you too, Samuel. But more than that, I like who I am when I'm with you." "Does that mean?" he started to ask. "It means Elias Hartwell can wait for that train until it grows wings and flies away," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Samuel's smile was like sunrise. "In that case, I have something to ask you." He dropped to one knee right there in the barnyard, still holding her hands. "Margaret, will you marry me? Not because it's convenient or expected, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." As Samuel stood up and pulled her into his arms, Margaret heard the distant whistle of the evening train. Soon, Hartwell would realize she wasn't coming. He would board that train alone and disappear back to whatever corner of the world he had crawled out of. But she wouldn't think about him anymore. She had wasted enough time worrying about the opinions of people who didn't matter. From now on, she would focus on building a life with someone who did. When Samuel kissed her, she finally understood what it felt like to be truly seen and truly valued, and she knew her mother would have been proud. Act 9. The choice made clear. The church bell started ringing at exactly 3 o'clock, but it wasn't calling people to prayer. Margaret heard the urgent clanging as she stood face to face with Hartwell outside the general store. The sound meant trouble was coming to town. Big trouble. Fire! Someone shouted from down the street. Fire at the McKinnon place. Margaret's heart stopped. Samuel had gone home early to fix a broken wagon wheel. If the fire was bad, if he was trapped inside, she lifted her skirts and ran. Behind her, Hartwell called out, but his words got lost in the wind. Her boots pounded against the dusty ground as she raced toward the black smoke rising from Samuel's forge. The townspeople were already forming a bucket line from the well to Samuel's workshop. Flames licked at the wooden walls, growing bigger by the minute. Margaret searched the crowd with wild eyes. "Where's Samuel?" She grabbed Mrs. Ferguson's arm. "Where is he?" "Inside," the woman gasped, passing another bucket down the line. "He went in to save his tools. That was 5 minutes ago." Without thinking, Margaret pushed through the crowd toward the burning building. Strong hands caught her arms. "You can't go in there," Cordelia Whitman said firmly. "It's too dangerous for a woman." Margaret spun around, her eyes blazing. "Too dangerous? Samuel is in there." She broke free and ran toward the forge. The heat hit her face like a slap. Smoke made her eyes water, but she could see Samuel's shape near the back wall. He was dragging something heavy toward the door, coughing hard. "Samuel!" she screamed. A burning beam crashed down between them, sending sparks flying everywhere. Samuel looked up and saw her. His face went white with fear. "Get back!" he yelled. "The roof's going to fall." But Margaret was already moving. She grabbed a wet blanket from someone's hands and threw it over her head. The crowd behind her was shouting, but she couldn't hear the words. All she could see was Samuel trapped on the other side of the flames. She found a path along the wall where the fire hadn't spread yet. Her dress caught on a nail and tore, but she kept going. When she reached Samuel, he was trapped under a fallen shelf. "You crazy woman," he gasped as she helped lift the heavy wood off his leg. "Why did you come in here?" "Because I love you," she said, surprising herself with how easy the words came. "And love doesn't wait for safe moments." Together, they stumbled toward the door. The roof was making terrible cracking sounds above them. Just as they reached the entrance, Hartwell appeared in the doorway. "This way," he shouted, reaching out to help them. For a split second, Margaret looked into Hartwell's eyes. She saw something she had never seen before, real concern for another person's safety. Maybe he wasn't as selfish as she had thought. The three of them tumbled out of the burning building just as the roof collapsed behind them. The crowd cheered and rushed forward with blankets and water. Dr. Peterson checked Samuel's leg while Margaret sat beside him on the ground. Her dress was black with soot. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her hands were shaking. But she had never felt stronger in her life. "It's not broken," the doctor announced. "Just bruised badly. You'll be limping for a few weeks, but you'll heal just fine." Hartwell stood nearby, brushing ash off his fancy coat. His face was thoughtful as he watched Margaret tend to Samuel's scraped hands. "That was very brave what you did," he said quietly. Margaret looked up at him. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Hartwell shook his head slowly. "They wouldn't have. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about seeing strength where others see flaws." He paused, studying her soot-covered face. "I was wrong about you, Margaret. Completely wrong." The crowd was starting to break up now that the excitement was over. Some people were offering Samuel places to stay while his home was being repaired. Others were already planning a barn-raising style event to help him rebuild. "Mr. Hartwell," Margaret said, standing up and brushing dirt off her skirt. "I want to thank you for helping us get out of there. That was kind of you." "It was the right thing to do," he replied. Then he looked directly at her. "Just like what you're about to do is the right thing." Margaret tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" Hartwell smiled, but it was different from his earlier confident grin. This smile was sad and honest. "You're going to choose him, aren't you?" "Samuel." It wasn't really a question. Margaret could hear the certainty in his voice. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." "Good," Hartwell nodded. "He's a lucky man. I hope he knows it." Samuel struggled to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. "I know exactly how lucky I am," he said, looking at Margaret. "She just ran into a burning building to save me. I think that settles any questions about her courage." The late afternoon sun was painting the sky orange and pink. In the distance, Margaret could see people already loading wagons with lumber and supplies for Samuel's rebuilding project. The whole town was coming together to help, even people who had gossiped about her just days before. "There's something else," Hartwell said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out an envelope. "This came for you on today's train, Margaret. It's from Boston." Margaret's hands trembled as she took the letter. The return address was from her old boarding house. With shaking fingers, she opened it and read. Her face went pale, then flushed pink, then pale again. "What is it?" Samuel asked, concerned. "It's from Mrs. Henley," Margaret whispered. "The woman who runs the boarding house where I lived before I came here. She says..." Margaret's voice got stronger as she read. "She says my Uncle Theodore died and left me money. Quite a lot of money." Samuel and Hartwell both stared at her. "How much money?" Samuel asked carefully. Margaret looked at the letter again. "Enough to buy a house, or start a business. Or..." She glanced at Samuel's burned forge. "Enough to help rebuild a blacksmith shop with all new equipment." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, watching the smoke drift away from the ruined building. "Well," Hartwell said finally, "that changes things considerably." "No," Margaret said firmly, folding the letter and putting it in her pocket. "It doesn't change anything that matters." She walked over to Samuel and took his hands in hers. They were rough and scarred from years of working with hot metal and heavy tools. She had grown to love those hands, and everything they represented about the man who owned them. "Samuel McKinnon," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I have a question for you." Samuel's eyes grew wide. "Margaret, what are you doing?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me," she announced. "Right here, right now, in front of everyone." A gasp went up from the crowd that had gathered to listen. In 1885, women simply did not propose marriage to men. It was scandalous. It was shocking. It was exactly what Margaret wanted to do. Samuel's face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. "Are you sure? Even with my leg hurt? Even with my shop burned down? Even with all these people staring at us? Especially with all these people staring at us?" Margaret grinned back. "I want everyone to know that I choose you. Not because I have to, not because I have no other choice, but because you're the best man I've ever known." "Then yes," Samuel said, pulling her close despite his injured leg. "Yes, I'll marry you, Margaret." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Even Cordelia Whitman was wiping tears from her eyes. Hartwell stepped forward and extended his hand to Samuel. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "Take good care of her." "I will," Samuel promised, shaking the other man's hand. As the sun set over Clearwater Station, Margaret realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. If Hartwell hadn't rejected her, she never would have met Samuel. If there hadn't been a fire, she might never have found the courage to speak her heart so boldly. But one question still remained. Would the town accept their unusual engagement, or would there be more challenges ahead? Margaret's wedding dress caught fire on her wedding day, but she married Samuel anyway. It happened exactly 1 hour before the ceremony was supposed to start. She was getting ready in the back room of the church when her sleeve brushed too close to the oil lamp. The white fabric went up in flames faster than summer grass. "Don't panic," called out Sarah Peterson, the doctor's wife, as she helped Margaret pat out the flames. "We'll figure something out." Margaret stood there in her burned dress, looking at the black marks on what was supposed to be the most beautiful outfit of her life. 6 months ago, this would have felt like the end of the world. Today, she started laughing. "What's so funny?" asked Mary Sullivan, who had volunteered to fix Margaret's hair. "6 months ago, I thought my whole life depended on being perfect," Margaret said, still giggling. "Now look at me. My dress is ruined. My hair is falling down, and I've never been happier." The women looked at each other and started laughing too. Soon the whole room was filled with the sound of joy. "I have an idea," announced Cordelia Whitman, stepping into the room. Margaret was surprised to see her there. Cordelia had been one of her harshest critics when she first arrived in town. "Mrs. Whitman," Margaret said carefully, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Well," Cordelia said with a small smile, "I've been thinking about some things, about how I treated you when you first came to town, about what real Christian charity looks like." She held up a beautiful blue dress. "This was my daughter's. She wore it to her wedding before she moved to California. I think it might fit you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The dress was stunning, deep blue silk with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar. "Mrs. Whitman, I can't accept this. It's too precious." "Nonsense," Cordelia said firmly. "What good is a wedding dress sitting in a trunk?" "Besides," she added more softly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew you. That wasn't right." As Margaret changed into the blue dress, she realized how much had changed in such a short time. The same women who had whispered about her were now helping her get ready for her wedding. The same town that had rejected her was now celebrating her happiness. The dress fit perfectly. When Margaret walked down the aisle 30 minutes later, she could hear people gasp. Not because anything was wrong, but because she looked so beautiful. The blue silk made her eyes sparkle like jewels. Her hair, which Sarah had quickly repinned, caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the church windows. But the most beautiful thing was her smile. Samuel stood at the front of the church in his best suit, watching her walk toward him. His face showed pure wonder, as if he couldn't believe this amazing woman was choosing to marry him. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with great joy. When he asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the church stayed completely silent. Even Elias Hartwell, who was sitting in the back row, nodded his approval. "Do you, Margaret Elizabeth Harper, take Samuel James McKinnon to be your husband?" Pastor Williams asked. "I do," Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "With all my heart." "Do you, Samuel James McKinnon, take Margaret Elizabeth Harper to be your wife?" "I do," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For as long as I live." When Pastor Williams said, "You may kiss your bride," the whole church erupted in cheers and applause. Margaret had never heard such a happy sound. But the real surprises came at the reception. The townspeople had organized a feast in the church basement. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted chicken, fresh bread, apple pies, and every delicious thing the good cooks of Clearwater could create. As Margaret and Samuel sat at the head table, people kept coming up to them with gifts and good wishes. Some brought practical things like quilts and cooking pots. Others brought more unusual presents. "This is for you, Mrs. McKinnon," said Timothy Fletcher, the young man who delivered telegrams. He handed her a small wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal with blank pages. "For writing down your adventures," Timothy explained. "My ma said every interesting woman should keep a record of her life." Margaret was touched. She had always loved to write, but had never thought anyone else would care about her stories. Then came the biggest surprise of all. Judge Harrison stood up and clinked his fork against his water glass to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I have some news that I think will interest the bride and groom." Everyone quieted down to listen. "As you know, Samuel's blacksmith shop was damaged in last week's fire. What you don't know is that the railroad company has been looking for someone to set up a new workshop right here in Clearwater. They need someone to shoe their horses and repair their equipment." Samuel's eyes grew wide. "Judge, what are you saying?" "I'm saying they want to hire you, Samuel. Full-time. Good pay. And they'll help you build a brand new shop twice the size of your old one." The room burst into applause. Margaret grabbed Samuel's hand under the table. This was more than they had dared to hope for. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. There's more, he continued. They also need someone to manage the books and handle correspondence with their headquarters in Chicago. Someone who can read and write well, who understands numbers, who can deal with difficult people. He looked directly at Margaret. They've asked if I know anyone qualified for such a position. Margaret's heart started beating fast. Judge, are you offering me a job? Indeed I am, Mrs. McKinnon. If you're interested. Margaret looked around the room at all the faces watching her. 6 months ago, these same people had thought she was worthless. Now they were celebrating her talents and offering her opportunities. I'm very interested, she said firmly. The crowd cheered even louder than before. As the evening went on, Margaret found herself in the strangest conversation of her life. Elias Hartwell approached her during a quiet moment when Samuel was talking with some of the other men. Margaret, Hartwell said, I want to say something to you. She braced herself, not sure what to expect. You were right, he said simply. About everything. I was looking for the wrong things in a wife. I was thinking about what other people would say, not about what would make me happy. Margaret studied his face. He looked older somehow, sadder but wiser. I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Hartwell, she said gently. I think I have, he replied. I've learned that I need to become a better man before I deserve a good woman. That's going to take some time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. This is for you and Samuel. A wedding gift. Use it to help set up your new home. Margaret opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was enough money to buy furniture for an entire house. Mr. Hartwell, this is too much. No, he said firmly. It's exactly what I owe you. For the pain I caused. For the lesson you taught me about what really matters. He tipped his hat. Be happy, Margaret. You deserve it. As the party wound down and people started heading home, Margaret and Samuel found themselves alone in the church basement, surrounded by wedding gifts and leftover cake. Can you believe all of this? Samuel asked, gesturing at the piles of presents. No, Margaret admitted. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I have a husband I love, friends who care about me, and a job where people actually want my opinions. Samuel limped over to her, his leg was still healing from the fire, and wrapped his arms around her waist. You know what the best part is, he said softly. What? We get to have adventures together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it side by side. Margaret thought about the journal Timothy had given her. Tonight, she would write about this perfect, imperfect day. About the dress that caught fire and the one that replaced it. About the people who changed their minds about her worth. About the man who saw her value from the very beginning. But first, she had one more surprise for Samuel. There's something I didn't tell you about my uncle's inheritance, she said mysteriously. Samuel raised his eyebrows. What do you mean? Margaret smiled and pulled a second letter from her pocket. Uncle Theodore didn't just leave me money. He left me something else too. What? A house, she said, watching Samuel's face change from confusion to amazement. A big house with 6 bedrooms and a huge kitchen. In Denver, Colorado. Samuel stared at her. Margaret, what are you saying? I'm saying we have choices, she replied. We can stay here in Clearwater and build our life with the railroad. Or we can take that house and start fresh somewhere new. Or we can sell the house and use the money for something completely different. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, thinking. What do you want to do? He asked finally. Margaret looked around the church basement where the whole town had just celebrated their happiness. She thought about the job offer, about the friends she was making, about the life they were building together. I want to stay here, she said. This town gave us a chance when we needed it most. I think we should give it a chance too. Samuel's smile lit up his whole face. Then that's what we'll do. As they walked home together under the starry sky, Margaret realized that her journey was just beginning. She had traveled hundreds of miles to find a husband, but what she had really found was herself. The woman who had stepped off the train 6 months ago, hoping to be acceptable to a stranger, was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, who could run into burning buildings when someone she loved was in danger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to grow and learn and love. But tonight, Margaret McKinnon was exactly where she belonged, walking hand in hand with her husband toward the life they would build together. And for the first time in her life, she knew without a doubt that she was enough exactly as she was.